Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? Yes, and how many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? Welcome to episode 42. The answer is 42. I'm so glad you're here today. This episode is going to be a little break from the series on disconnection from the body because I have known since I started this podcast that episode 42 was going to be about the question of life, the universe, and everything in one way or another. More specifically, it was going to be about my answer to that question. And since I am going into the week of my 42nd birthday, I finally had enough excitement and dopamine to get over the inertia of not writing and not producing episodes in order to write this specific episode. The power of synchronicity. If you're a bit lost as to what 42 has to do with anything, allow me. In Douglas Adams' series, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, as you can probably guess from the title, is science fiction, it is revealed that the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything actually cannot coexist in the same universe as the answer to that question. It would unbind the universe itself, like a collision of matter and antimatter, and, therefore, any given iteration of the universe, whether you're talking multiverses or a succession of universes that implode and then rebirth and then implode again and then rebirth again, whichever way you mean any iteration of the universe, well, any iteration of the universe will only have one, the question or the answer. In our universe, we have the answer. The answer is 42. So what's the question? We don't really know. We can't know. But the answer is 42. This is why that number is revered in nerd space. You're welcome. Now, in the book where this concept is introduced, the characters pick an arbitrary question and move on. They settle on how many roads must a man walk down, which is, of course, a reference to the song I opened with. It's an old Bob Dylan tune that has been covered many times by many artists, but is probably most associated with Joan Baez. How many roads must a man walk down before we call him a man? The second man in that lyric could be interpreted many ways. Before he is considered an adult, before he is considered wise, before he attains his own individual identity, and so forth. I have actually begun to hear that second man as meaning self-actualized, as being someone, male or female, man in the sense of human, who is not driven by social expectations, trauma, egoic defenses, emotional whims, or instinctual impulses. Someone who can hold their own emotional and moral center regardless of the situation. Someone who has chosen to view the gift of consciousness and metacognition as a duty to compassion, empathy, and the consideration of all things. not just other people, but also the natural world and the web of life we are all connected to and dependent upon. One of the books I've read that articulated and refined the perspective I was coming to about being fully human, in the sense of living up to the true capacity our style of consciousness allows us, is Scott Barry Kaufman's book, Transcend. Scott is one of the philosophical leaders in positive psychology right now, and that book is his revision and expansion upon Maslow's hierarchy of needs model. Kaufman suggests that there is a developmental point at that apex of self-actualization where we cross over into a new way of being. Basically, becoming self-actualized is not the culmination of our work as humans, but rather the beginning of our work. Once we fully become, then we can focus in healthy ways on the collective, on others, on being good stewards of the world rather than exploiters, and so forth. And this process is not meant to be something only a few lucky or exceptional people attain, but rather it's the birthright of us all. We are meant to become fully human in this way and meant to live in societies of fully realized, emotionally centered people. I genuinely believe this. In my opinion, there is an end point to healing and recovery from the past, including emotional and psychological trauma. There is no end point to growth and change and self-discovery. We'll get to why in a bit. But healing is not necessarily a lifelong journey. It might be in the sense that someone does not have enough time left to heal everything they need to, but that is not the same as it being a process without an end. Healing, to me, is growing through the developmental arrests and self-imposed limitations that are a result of adverse experiences. Healing is processing and integrating the experiences that overwhelmed us with pain, confusion, fear, or rage, so that they are part of the story we have lived, but not a defining feature of it. Healing is replacing the distorted beliefs that were derived from our wounding with beliefs rooted in the actual reality of the world and our potential. Healing does not mean making it so the bad things never happened. It means replacing an open wound with scar tissue and new skin. And that is a task that can be completed. Growing through the stages we skipped or weren't allowed to work through, and learning the skills we were not allowed to develop at the expected age are tasks that can be completed. Now, Western culture, in my opinion, is built on collective developmental arrests and unprocessed trauma. But just because it is normalized not to have healed in the senses of becoming fully adult, fully transcended, doesn't make it normal. It is not the biologically optimal way to live. As humans, we have the capacity to transcend those constraints and become fully realized individuals. As a culture, we lack the resources, willpower, and collective narratives to believe that a majority of us can transcend our demons. We also lack a culture-wide understanding of how to do it. Literally see my introduction episode for why I started this podcast in the first place. But that ignorance in our culture doesn't change our innate human capacity for doing these things, nor the fact that we are leaving half our individual and collective potential unrealized by not crossing that self-actualization divide. So that concept of human as self-actualized and transcended beyond our initial phase of learning is what I take that second man to mean, at least in the context of this philosophical question, right? How many roads must a man walk down before we call him a man? How many roads must someone walk to become a self-actualized human who has crossed that divide and developed past the limitations of trauma and ego and social conditioning? Well, 42, obviously. Now, what are those roads? Because they're probably not literal roadways. Well, I've had a few thoughts on this. Oh, what a shock. I've had some thoughts. First, maybe it refers to the number of years that someone needs to have lived to attain something like wisdom, or for the average person. Average here meaning not extra traumatized, but also not deliberately growth-seeking. So for the average person to reach a point where crossing that self-actualization divide is possible. Maybe 42 is the number of attempts that must be made at a new skill or a new process in order to gain mastery of it. Maybe those are the roads. Maybe it's the number of different perspectives on the world that someone must aggregate in order to transcend their own ego and cultural conditioning. You need 42 different perspectives. Those are the roads you walk. Or maybe the roads you walk are ego deaths, and that's the number of times you need to lose your sense of self and replace it with a new one born from the ashes of the old in order to permanently become open and wholehearted and able to accept change with grace, no matter what that change is. Maybe those roads are the number of pieces of yourself that have to be brought back home from exile or suppression. Or in a similar vein, maybe it's the number of shamanic journeys you need in order to reconcile to your past. Could be the number of vulnerable interactions we need with another person to fully trust them. Or maybe it's the number of stories we need to hear about someone else's experience in order to deeply understand them. Or maybe it's the number of books we need to read on a topic to know it inside and out. Or maybe it's the number of novels we need to read to fully develop our empathy. Or maybe it's the number of poems we need to absorb into our heart to comprehend the depths of human emotion. Or maybe it's the number of shades of green or blue or brown that we need to identify in one landscape to begin to grasp the intricacy of our natural world. Or, there's an infinite number of meanings that question and answer could be applied to. How many roads must a man walk down? These are the ones that occurred to me, which means these are the ones that in some way reflect my experience of self and world, and my attentional biases, and my values. Aside from being part of my perspective, though, what all of these interpretations of the symbol have in common is complexity. Either a layering of many multiple experiences of the same thing, or a layering of many different ideas into one aggregate understanding. This notion of complexity being the path to becoming your transcended self aligns to my belief about what defines living as your quote-unquote best self. Last spring, I had an episode about living your best life, and I said that I think your best life is your most intentional life, and your best self is the one who is living that intentional life. In the months since then, I have revised my perspective a little bit. Currently, I think your best self is a different category than your best life. I think your best self is your most complex self. The deliberately chosen self, living the deliberately chosen life, is the best experiential self. I still think that. But your most complex self is the best system of the psyche version of yourself. My mentor in Jungian type and Myers-Briggs Dr. Dario Nardi, likens the cognitive system of type preferences to a mandala. It is a pattern of growth that can unfold a number of different ways depending on the interplay between our type and our life circumstances, but it is meant to build out in layers and become increasingly complex over time. If you visualize a mandala being drawn, the metaphor makes more sense. A mandala starts as a relatively simple central shape to which petals and ornamentation are added again and again and again until a complicated, balanced symbol has replaced the simple shape without entirely covering that original shape. It's still there, visible at the heart of the symbol, but it is no longer the entirety of the shape. And a mandala can be drawn in an infinite number of ways, even starting from the same basic shape. This variability reflects the difference in lived experience between two individuals of the same type, or even the exact same potential based on where they both fall on the spectrum of human traits. No two lives will unfold exactly in the same way. No two individuals will make the exact same choices to have the exact same experiences. No two mandalas will be drawn exactly the same way, even if they start from the same place. The metaphor extends another way, too. A mandala is indefinitely expandable, just like our psyches. As long as we are alive, we have the capacity to grow and add experiences and knowledge to our system of self. In other words, the pen that is tracing out our mandala of self does not have to stop adding either new petals or new ornamentation until we stop being. This idea of being a continual work in progress, a continually expanding symbol, is at the core of a growth-seeking approach to life. It's a desire to seek out more from life and also to embrace what is found, to really fold it in to the sense of self. You see, there's a difference between merely experiencing something and actually integrating it. We can have experiences that are consumed and then forgotten almost as soon as they are over. Those experiences do not leave a mark upon us such that we will be forever altered by that exposure. In our mandala metaphor, those experiences would be like tracing over lines that have already been drawn in and adding nothing to the symbol. Pleasurable or relaxing, perhaps, and as such not necessarily bad, but also not adding to our complexity. Personal development, by the way, is not an exception to this phenomenon. We can have epiphanies and moments of insight or clarity that are forgotten without causing us to change. Information that we do not integrate, in other words, that we do not use to make a change, becomes entertainment more than knowledge. Integration takes intention most of the time. We have to look directly at the new idea or new experience to understand and see how it affects ourself. We also have to look at how it changes the ideas around it. Because integration doesn't just add to our knowledge, it changes the relationship between pieces of our knowledge. A mandala does not stay the same as it develops. You can still see all the original lines. They don't leave the symbol, but their meaning to the whole changes as the whole symbol changes. The same process should be happening in our system of self as we have more experiences and gain more knowledge as a result of living and learning. Now, a mandala does not have to be constantly expanding in size to be expanding in complexity. Similarly, we do not have to be constantly integrating novel experiences in order to be increasing our own complexity. Novel experiences, or big new learnings, would be akin to new leaves being drawn onto a mandala. But in a mandala, there are also internal lines that kind of crisscross over existing petals, and they add intricacy without adding more surface area. And then some lines end up being drawn more thickly than others. So darkening lines like that also changes the visual impact of the symbol, even if no new petals or other details are being added. So we can still be adding complexity to our mandala of self, even in times when we can't add new leaves. The more we explore the internal connections between pieces of knowledge, between our past and present, between our ideals and our lived experiences, the more intricacy we can add to our mandala. When we are living on repeat and doing many repetitions of the same thing, we can darken lines on our mandala to show that we changed our relationship to that action or experience as a result of long exposure to it. Instead of tuning out the monotony of repetition, we can stay tuned in and ask what could be learned from deep intimacy with a process or experience, or a person for that matter. There will be times of life when it is easy to add new leaves and expand the mandala outwardly. There will be times when the only way to change the mandala is by adding depth to existing lines or adding connections between existing lines. But all of it adds complexity. There is no time limit on growth. Life is not a race. Becoming our fully actualized self, as in actualizing 100% of all of our potentials in all realms of life, that is not possible. As long as you live and choose to grow, you will find new dimensions to explore in the system of yourself. You cannot ever get to a there where you have become your most complex and multifaceted self and then triumphantly live as that self for the rest of your life. That's not how it works. There is always another next self, a more complex self that you could become. It's like counting infinity. What is bigger than infinity? Well, infinity plus 1, obviously. But what is infinity plus 1, really? Oh, it's just infinity. There is no endpoint to your potential, only an endpoint to what you are actually able to draw into your mandala of self in the time you were given. Therefore, there is no final mandala you're trying to unfold. There's no rush to get anywhere. And there is no best mandala. The mandala with 10 layers of leaves is not inherently better than the one with 6. When you ask which has more complexity, you must consider, does the one with only 6 layers of petals have more internal lines, a density that is not present in the one that takes up more space? Does the one with fewer petals have more robust lines to create more shapes within the shape? Or are you measuring complexity by the number of petals? To compare the intricacy and complexity of two mandalas, you must look at multiple dimensions of the symbol. Perhaps some will show less intricacy and less surface area, but a smaller surface area does not necessarily mean a loss of complexity, and might, in fact, indicate much more complexity than something which is simply spread widely onto a surface. All of these different mandalas are complex. All of them represent different journeys of self that were unfolded. They are simply different paths. One version of you learned more lessons. Another version of you gained more wisdom because you went over the same lessons multiple times. Your best self is the one that embraces the complexity most available to you as you are now, as your life is now. The mandala of self can never be completed. It is not a goal with an end point. It is a process, a meditation. It's a journey with no set destination. The self unfolds alongside the road it travels. The roads it chooses to travel change the lines that get drawn in. The mandala's lines change meaning as the mandala changes. Our story of ourself changes as we change. So this is my answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. What I interpret as the question, how do we then live? You embrace the experiences on offer to you. If you cannot add intricacy to your mandala, then you need to look for ways to expand it and add new leaves. If you cannot add new leaves, then look for ways to add to the density of current lines or to create more lines connecting the current leaves. Live where you are and allow your experiences to change you, because only by allowing them in a deep way, in a way that changes us, can we increase our complexity. So, how many roads must we walk to unfold the complexity of self? The answer is 42. But which roads you walk and how you draw those lines in your mandala of self, well, that's up to you. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com. If you like what I'm doing here and want to help the podcast grow, you can leave me a review or join my Patreon at patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?